So here is a summary for the first two chapters of First Chronicles. So, like we finished off Second Kings, uh, we kind of put ourselves in the place of envisioning all of this narrative as imagine you're watching a TV show, like a TV series, right? And it's one of the craziest season finales ever because God did exactly as, God allowed events to turn out exactly as he foretold. When the kingdom of Judah refused to learn from the outcomes of their brothers in the kingdom of Israel, and each generation of kings, even though there were some exceptions who turned to God, we see there was an overwhelming majority of kings who led the people astray and did abominations before God's eyes. To the point where the abominations that happened in the kingdom of Judah started to surpass the things that the Canaanites were doing before the land vomited them out in judgment. So, true to God's word, the people are exiled from their own land and taken by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. So after that crazy season finale, we're using First Chronicles and Second Chronicles to basically recap, to refresh our memories on how we got to um, this point, right, in the narrative, and also to give us sneak peeks into the details that were not covered in, compared to Chronicles, First and Second Kings were kind of like, breezing through like the events. If you remember how Deuteronomy served to give us more insider details into the things that were happening from between like Exodus to Numbers, like that's what Deuteronomy was serving, the role that it served, right? So Chronicles, it's chronicling down everything that has happened, and filling in the gaps of our understanding as to what has been happening. So yeah, I don't need to tell you. You probably already saw when you read the first two chapters are all lineages, and it's easy to just kind of zone out with those two chapters, especially since it's just, oh, these are fathers and their sons and their sons and their sons and their sons. But as with everything in the Word of God, there's a purpose behind it. So that's why I kind of refrain from the Kahoot, and I'm not gonna spend too much time with the summary either. We're gonna probably we're gonna kind of approach this with a different take, so we can get the most we can out of these two chapters. All right, chapter one. The chapter begins by tracing the lineage of from Adam through Seth to Noah, highlighting the chosen line through which God's plan of redemption will proceed. So notice that only Seth's line is included. If you checked out that commentary, right? You probably may have seen it mentioning that Seth, we don't see mentionings of the descendants of Cain or anything, right? Now, Abel didn't have any mentionable descendants, but like we don't see anything of Cain's that is mentioned. Only Seth's line is included, which foreshadows God's selective purposes in salvation history. We're reading the Old Testament with the lens of seeing how it's all pointing to Christ from the very beginning. The goal was like reaching Christ and what that purpose was for the salvation of humanity. After listing 10 generations from Adam to Noah, the chapter names Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who represent the ancestral heads of all post-flood humanity. We all, you've probably thought about how, oh, all of mankind, like all the human beings alive on Earth right now are related to each other. We have like shared family trees at some point because everything goes back to Adam, but everything also goes back to Noah, who was 10 generations after Adam, because as we know, the flood, the global flood that wiped out all other life, all other human life. We know that only Noah and his family were preserved, so all of the populations of Earth come from his three sons. The genealogy continues with the sons and further descendants of Japheth, traditionally associated with many people spreading into the northern and coastal regions. Ham's sons, Cush, Mizraim, who is known as Egypt, Put, and Canaan, are listed, representing the origins of many African and Near Eastern peoples, including the Canaanites and other nations familiar in Israel's history. If I've said that I wouldn't talk too much in the middle of the summary. We'll have a time to talk about like individual people while we're discussing. But if you remember how Ham was cursed by Noah because of how Ham uncovered and exposed his father's nakedness, to kind of put a mockery to his father when his father was in a drunken state, Ham was cursed. And we see his descendants are the Canaanites. And we saw how those peoples were basically ousted from the land when the Israelites came because they just gave themselves over to sin. From Shem comes several lines, including Arphaxad, through whom the Hebrew patriarchs descend. This section begins the line that leads towards Abraham. The names proceed from Arphaxad through Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and finally to Abram. All those names are it's representing like one lineage. Like Eber's the father of Peleg, who is the father of Ru, so on and so forth. Finally to Abraham, establishing the chosen line from which Israel and the covenant people will emerge. The chapter then lists Abraham's sons, Isaac, who was the covenant heir, and Ishmael, who was the son of the Egyptian slave Hagar, and the significance that both sons show in the broader scope of God's promises and peoples. Because again, Ishmael was the product of Abraham trying to rely on his own wisdom when he felt like God was taking too long on God's promise, right? Instead of trusting and waiting upon the Lord and exhibiting the same faith that he exhibited when he first left his homeland and his people to follow God's voice to the promised land, he kept on relying on the wisdom, his own wisdom, the wisdom of his wife, everything, which, I mean, delayed his promise, but also created a lot of detours in between. Ishmael's 12 sons are named, representing the fulfillment of God's promise that he would become a great nation. That the prophecies about Ishmael also included that his descendant, he would always have an enmity against his brethren, and they would like fight each other. If I remember right, like the phrase was like Ishmael would be like a donkey in terms of like rebellion, always at odds with his brethren. And that's what came to be, foreshadowing the future Arab peoples. They are the descendants of Ishmael. We see, indeed, as the prophecy shows, the Arab peoples were blessed. They, are numerous in the world. They're blessed. They're prosperous in all the world. But we also know that through them, I mean, there's a lot of infighting within their groups as well as, products of sin through them happening around the world. Keturah's sons, Abraham's children by his later wife, Keturah was another wife of Abraham that he took later, are listed. And then the genealogy list shifts to Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob, as we know, who became Israel, known as Israel. Esau's sons and the chiefs of the land of Seir, also called Edom, are also recorded. So the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. So it shows the extensive family networks surrounding Israel. It's not mentioned here, but I guess since we're talking about like the vast family trees and the branches and everything, it's worth mentioning if you remember the Moabites and the Ammonites, those come from Abraham's nephew Lot. His like sons. They were his sons, but they were born through his daughters. If you remember the twisted way that happened. Okay, the chapter concludes with a list of early kings and chiefs of Edom before Israel had a king. So the Edomites had kings. They had a whole system of like kingship and royalty before the Israelites ever had like a cohesive identity as a people. Even before even before any kingship of theirs, which is interesting because maybe, I don't know, it gives some more context as to how the Israelites were always clamoring for a king. They wanted to be like everybody else around him, like them the Edomites were the Israelites like distant like cousins, brethren. So seeing how every other kind of civilization, like people group around them was having kings, they had their own like fanfare for stuff. Like Israel might have felt left out, but as we know, as Samuel says, right, they rejected God as their true king, in wanting a king and wanting to emulate the ways of the peoples around them. So these lists emphasize the historical reality and prominence of surrounding nations, even those not in the covenant line, illustrating God's sovereign orchestration of history. You might be wondering, okay, well, if like the whole salvation plan is focusing on the descendants of Israel, why are we wasting time with Esau? Why are we wasting time talking about Ishmael and like Ham and everybody if they're not part of the actual line that's leading to Christ? Well, it's giving us so much context as to all the other people that the Israelites are interacting with. Like, where do they come from? How this has always been seen, foreseen, how God has always been in control, how he has always been sovereign. Um, I always keep connecting this back to shows, right? But if you guys are like watchers of shows that take like a pause and like they don't give you all the lore like at the very beginning, but later on they kind of show you like the forefathers of the current characters to give you a better sense as to the dynamics of the current characters because of the lines that they came from. I don't know if I'm just rambling at this point, but hopefully you're catching my drift. I just find this so, it's interesting to see, I mean, whether or not it's interesting, it's the truth that God's always been in control of the narrative of each generation of how the peoples have like evolved and changed and grown. Okay, chapter 2. The chapter opens by identifying the 12 sons of Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, forming the tribe foundation of the nation. These sons, their names are not mentioned in order, by the way. Although all 12 tribal lines are named, the chronicler's focus quickly zeroes in on Judah because from this tribe comes the line of David and the future kings of Israel. I should also point out that it kind of makes sense that whoever the chronicler is, who's authoring the Chronicles, it makes sense that they're zeroing in on Judah. I mean, where we are in history right now, we understand that the Holy Spirit deliberately allowed this as well because Christ was going to come through this line, right? But also, I guess in another like practical sense, the exiles from the kingdom of Judah, like the kingdom of Judah was made up of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin as well. So they made up the majority of the population of this kingdom. So it would make sense that the lineage it would focus more on the tribe of Judah. If you what happened to the rest of the tribes? If we remember, they were part of the kingdom of Israel who were conquered by the Assyrians, which we already read about. Judah's sons are listed as Er, Onan, and Shelah. This is like way, way back, if you remember, in Genesis. We read about these guys in Genesis. Er and Onan are noted for their wickedness. Er is put to death by God, and Onan's story connects with themes of covenant responsibility. Onan was also like put to death by God. Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, who was the wife of Er, right? Um, she bears Perez and Zerah to Judah. All right. So again, God shows provision through broken circumstances. God didn't choose the perfect people, the honorable people, the people who got everything right to be in the lineage that led to Christ. We see completely messed up people. We see people who went through messy like mistakes, irredeemable, right? That's an interesting word to use, right? Irredeemable, like a line full of irredeemable people leading to the Redeemer, Christ. So it's all deliberate. Again, God is purposeful in all of this. Perez's sons are Hezron, Hamel, and Zerah's sons include Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, Dara. This expands the family lines within Judah and shows the breadth of his clans. The mention of Akar or Achan, if you remember Achan, that's interesting. I feel like I don't think I knew that Achan was from the tribe of Judah when we were talking about him. If for those who don't remember, Achan was the guy during the time when Israel was conquering Judah. Remember the walls around the city of Judah, circling around the walls, marching around them, shouting. The walls came down. What did Achan do? Even though the Israelites, God commanded them not to take any like valuable, any spoils of war from Jericho because those were like cursed and devoted to destruction. Achan still took things by secret and it damned the entire congregation of the Israelites. In the following battles, they kept losing pitifully because of Achan's sin. He's called the troubler of Israel, and in my translation, it called him the troubler of Israel. And it foreshadows like the unfaithfulness that was becoming a trend, that would become a greater trend throughout Israel. From Hezron comes carriers of Judah's legacy: Jeremiel, Ram, Caleb. Um, from Ram comes Abinadab, Nashon, Salma, Boaz, right? That's the same Boaz who married Ruth, right? Boaz and Ruth had their son Obed, who begot Jesse, who begot David, the seventh son listed of Jesse's, highlighting David's central role in Israel's history. I forgot to mention that Salmon, this is kind of, Salmon who married Rahab. We talked about Achan in Jericho, right? Salmon married Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho. So again, highlighting God's redemption in broken circumstances. Moving on. Jesse's other sons, Eliab, Abinadab, Shimeah, Nethanel rather, Radai and Ozem are named, plus his daughters Zeruiah and Abigail. We talked about these people, right? Because Zeruiah had three sons, which we talked a lot about: Abishai, Asahel, and oh, there he is, Joab. I was wondering where he is, right? You remember these guys from when we were talking about David, right? These were like his key military men, his nephews, basically. These were the sons of his sister. Amasa was the son of David's sister, Abigail, who this was another guy who was in David's narrative, you remember. Okay, a detailed listing follows for Jeremiel's sons and grandchildren, illustrating one branch of Judah's wider extended family and emphasizing thorough record keeping of tribal lines. Again, you might be thinking, why are we going through all these like family lines? It's purposeful because when these exiles, right, the kingdom of Judah, the people were taken as exiles to Babylon. At some point, these people are going to come back, right? Because God didn't give up on these people. He could have, he should have, but he didn't, right? Once these people, these exiles come back, so much time is going to have passed where things are going to get blurry. Like, you have to kind of trace back, okay, where do I come from? What family line do I come from? Because I guess practically it would also um, go towards like how the land is allotted again, right? So that the tribes don't lose their land and like deciding how to like make the borders of the territories whatnot. Like you need to know what family you come from for that. So that's these records are super important for that. The genealogy of Caleb, who was another son of Hezron, not the same Caleb from Joshua and Caleb. This is another guy, showing his offspring, including Mesha, Ziph, and the son of Marisha. This highlights another prominent family within the tribe of Judah. Again, it's taking pains like to talk about every single line that's happening in Judah. The descendants of Caleb's relatives and servants are also listed, showing further settlements and clan leaders, such as those associated with towns like Kirjath Jearim and Bethlehem and others. While much of this chapter is detailless of names, the chronicler's intent is to trace God's chosen line from Abraham through Judah to David onwards, confirming Israel's heritage and God's faithful unfolding of his promises across generations. Even though notice in these two chapters, right? We don't see a lot of mentionings of God, right? Like outright, right? Maybe here and there, like once or twice, right? But it is so evidently clear that he is the one behind the scenes orchestrating all of this. All right. So this is the summary of the two chapters. What we're gonna do is if you open up a WhatsApp, um, you will see the two links that I gave. It's both in the same website. It's just for those two chapters, chapter one and chapter two. It is the commentary. Basically, a lot of I really reached into a lot of that commentary for my summary as well. So what we'll do is we'll do what we usually do, right? We'll have the doc open. All of us will pick a portion of a verse. so on and so forth, something to say. I understand how these two chapters might be a little more difficult than usual because it's less narrative, more lineage. So that's why I'm having that option open. Like, look, if you're having trouble, or if you don't have if you have your own thoughts like from the chapter that you read that you want to share, be my guest, please. That has first priority. But if you're, if the lineage aspect of it is giving you like a block, then use those links, use those websites, peruse through the commentary, and pick out two things, three things that caught your attention, that made you think, that you found interesting, or something that you didn't know, or something that you did know that you finally had oh, like that's where that comes in moment, right? Connections to Christ, always, we talk about that, are the message of the year, right? Growing unto Christ. If you see that highlighted here anywhere, or you see anything that's opposite of that highlighted here anywhere, point that out. It's really, don't let the fact that this is just a big family tree, withhold the thoughts. It's here for a purpose. The Holy Spirit wants us to think about it. So, with the remaining time, we'll do just that. I will put the link to the doc in the chat, and then we will regroup. Okay, we'll regroup afterwards. All right, speeding through some thoughts here. You might wonder why I'm still keeping this along. For some reason, I can't bear to part with this for some reason. I should copy and paste it somewhere else. But anyway, chapter one. Just this was, I mean, these chapters just have been a game of how many names do I recognize, right? So, Enoch, I recall Enoch. He was a man who walked with God, right? In Genesis, it says that he walked with God, and he was taken without seeing death. Another person that we know who was taken without seeing death was Elijah. These were the two guys, the only two guys who were taken without seeing death. It's interesting because Elijah didn't have any like wife or children, any descendants, anything like that, but Enoch did. He fathered children, he had family life while walking with God. And while we were talking about him in Genesis, we made the point to say, hey, you can have a family, like you can have so many things going on, and that is not an excuse to not walk with God, as we see in Enoch's life. Going on, Ham. We talked about him in the middle of the summary. I mean, the point being Adam, Seth, Noah, Ham. The whole point of this all is to see brokenness and imperfection. As we know, Adam and Eve, right? Sin came through them, through their doubting of God, through their disobedience, right? The reason I bring, I point out Seth is because we know that Cain killed Abel. Cain was, I mean, basically exiled as, or like just he was a vagabond, right? He was just a wanderer after the events of that. So Adam and Eve had another son, Seth. They also had unnamed sons and daughters that are not like recorded, but the son that they had to bring them to restoration after the loss of their previous two children was Seth. So again, just inklings and hints of the the theme of it all, like the point of all of this is God's restoration. We saw that with Seth. Noah, we know how God saved mankind, right, through Noah, but how Noah fell to imperfection, right? We see him, even though he exhibited so much faith, so much obedience, he received grace from the Lord, right? He was blameless in his generation because of that grace he received, but eventually we see him getting comfortable and eventually getting drunk on the fruit of his own labor, wine, right? To the point where he was lying around without any clothes. And I mean, long story short, it leads him to cursing his son, Ham, right? I don't have time to mention this, but like we were talking about how, like, imagine the whole earth is yours, right? Like all the other people who existed in the earth are gone, and now it's just you and your sons, right? Like, how counteractive is it that you are cursing one of you? I mean, you were brought, as I'm saying you, I'm putting myself in the shoes of Noah. You're put in the position where you're drunk, right? It's because of your drunkenness that you were unclothed in the first place, right? But now we have Ham, who did not honor his father and went out and kind of just talked about his father's nakedness everywhere. So we have, I mean, wrongs on both sides, but ultimately, how shameful is it, how dishonorable is it that God is starting anew with Noah's family, only for it to like have curse from like that very generation, right? But again, the destructive sin in humanity and their desperate need for redemption is seen so evidently in this, and it's bringing us to the point that history was always his story, God's story. It's always been about restoration, bringing mankind back to God as they kept straying. Nimrod, uh, I don't remember talking about him a lot, but he shows up again. He's called a mighty man, but this is not exactly in a good connotation, because his time is supposed to be pointing like post-flood civilization, right? It was one of unchecked power and defiance of God, a lot of reliance on own strength and the things that man could do with his own wisdom and the collaboration with other men. So yeah, it's like a development of sin in his era, um, and rebellion. The Philistines, right? We know these guys, right? We've been hearing about them a lot through First and Second Samuel, if you remember. A constant enemy of the Israelites. So again, we're finally seeing a glimpse of where they come from, right? These chapters are very important because they were just there when we were reading in First Samuel. They just happened to like they were just there and they were the enemies of Israel. We just had to face that fact. But here we see, oh, they actually come from Ham. Like they come from somewhere, you know? But yeah, Ham also uh, is a forefather of Canaanites, right? The Jebusites, Amorites, those are familiar names, right? Those are the people that Israel had to rid the promised land of. Again, we see glimpses of origins of even enemies of Israel. And this is important. Why? Because the world has been continuing outside of the Israelites, like outside of Abraham's descendants. Like there were still other populations in the world. Just because we didn't see that part of the narrative, just because like the Israelites have been the main characters in this, or they have been the main focus of this, doesn't mean the world has not been, you know, continuing outside of them, right? So it's just so humbling to see how God has always been in control. Like God's not like us, where we can only put our attention to one place at one time. God's eyes are everywhere. He sees everything. He oversees everything. And that's what makes his covenant with Israel all the more special. All these people that exist in the earth, right? And God chooses this people, right? Because of Abraham's faith, he chooses this people to be the people in which God would send his way of salvation, or God himself would come down, right? Let's be real, right? Would come down and offer a way of salvation. And it makes you look back at all the times that the Israelites wanted to be like everybody else so bad, and they cheated on God, basically, right? Cheated on his covenant, cheated on his commandments because they felt like God didn't understand. But why wouldn't God understand? Because God's been seeing all of the other people. And every time God says to the Israelites, I do not want you to be like them, he's not saying that because God doesn't know, or God's just like a repressive, an oppressive, toxic parent or whatever, like a toxic partner. No, like God sees what everybody else is doing and the destruction that sin is causing in their midst. And God's like, I don't want you to be like them because I have so much better things in store for you. So when we say that God is a jealous God, it's not because of God's ignorance. There's no such thing as God's ignorance. It's because of his all knowledge, his omniscience, right? But yeah, moving on.
I just wanted to talk about the significance of Abraham's like name change, as it was done by God, which most name changes are, about how it was to fulfill the covenant that he had with Jesus and God about his numerous descendants from Abraham, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, meaning father of multitudes.
Yeah, piggybacking off of what Kevin said, like you see all of the lineages and descendants that are leading to, I mean, not just leading to Abraham, but happening all around Abraham, right? Um, so it makes like you understand where he was coming from, where he worried, like, am I going to be the last of my line, right? When he feared that he would have no sons, he would have no children to go on. But we see the faithfulness of God's covenant to him. God is the only reason why God's covenant is the only reason why Abraham's line flourished. Um, but furthermore, right? He Abraham is known as a father of faith, but Ishmael is the product of Abraham's lack of faith. I already mentioned this enough in the slides. But Genesis 16 verse 12, I kind of paraphrased it there during the summary, but Genesis 16 verse 12 is the actual place where Ishmael's that prophecy concerning Ishmael shows up, and that prophecy was given to his mother Hagar, right? 16 verse 12. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So, yeah. So, I mean, the descendants of Israel, I mean Ishmael, are still at odds with God's covenant and salvation to this very day. The Muslim people are blessed and prosperous because of God's covenant, the faithfulness of God's covenant to Ishmael and his descendants. But we do see, right, not just the first half of that prophecy being fulfilled, that they would be blessed, right, that they would, that they would be prosperous, but also the latter half, how Ishmael as a nation, as a group of people, would be rebellious and would always be at odds with themselves, like in within, like, within their groups, with their own people, and with people around them. That's what we're seeing around the world. And also at odds with God's covenant, God's way of salvation, how the lines of belief are so, like, different, how it's been tweaked and twisted, to be something that it's not. What Ishmael's descendants have done with it. But let us move onward. Anybody who highlighted this, for some reason it's not showing up when I click it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
So, uh, I mentioned hmm? I mentioned how Judah is mentioned here compared to the other brothers. It's mainly because there are many kings that come from Judah's lineage, and then we see how in like the next sentence afterwards, how it says, "Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord." Uh, this is interesting because we just talked about how there's many kings that come from his lineage, but God's grace is higher than the sins that they have committed. So God allows the kings to be born in his family line.
Oh, so what I wanted to say was that, um, like we finally came to like the sons of Israel, so we see how far like the lineage has came. That the lineage that started out with Abraham, all the way to the sons of Israel. So it shows like the importance of continuing God's work throughout these generations and how He has a purpose for every generation and every character.
Reminding me of Ezekiel, where like the book of Ezekiel talks about holiness, and it distinguishes holy things from common things, and how there's like a heavy emphasis on it. And here Achan's mistake was simple but serious because he treated what belonged to God like it was like a common thing.
Yeah. I also have a connection from what Reba said about Achan. We see uh, God's redemption. Again, like the whole point of this, if there's one takeaway from the entire Bible, the theme has always been restoration and redemption from the first page to the last. But again, Salmon, like I mentioned in the summary, Salmon married Rahab. Rahab was from Jericho. Jericho was the place that Achan took things that were devoted to destruction. It's so crazy to think, hey, everything in Jericho, people, the buildings, the wall, the animals, all the riches and the wealth and the spoil, whatnot, all those things were cursed and devoted to destruction. So you would think, hey, wouldn't Rahab naturally be included in that list of things of Jericho that are devoted to destruction? But it was purely because Rahab chose to have faith in a God that she did not know. She only heard about this God, the God of the Israelites, but she believed in that God. And that's how not only was she and her household saved, right, again, she's a prostitute. She's a prostitute from Jericho. There's like, she's the last of the last, the people who you would expect to survive this, right? You would think of her as the unholiest of the unholy, right? If all of Jericho is unholy, what would you think of a prostitute from Jericho, right? But somehow, not only was she grafted into the Israelites, but into the very line that would produce Christ. She became like a foremother, right? A great, 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 like a ancestor of Christ. It's crazy. Um, so as we see an insider, Achan, an insider in Israel, who broke faith, right? In the matter of things devoted to destruction, when he compromised holiness, we see an outsider, Rahab, who demonstrated faith and a willingness to leave the unholiness of her surroundings and her identity and to choose God. She gave birth to Boaz, right? Boaz is he represents, right, like the characteristics of Christ who would come after him, right? Boaz is known as the redeemer, the kinsman redeemer from the story of Ruth, right? Again, Ruth, someone from Moab, right? A people that were so cursed they were not allowed to come near Israel. They were cursed to the 10th generation, and yet we see Christ coming from the, again, lineage of imperfect people, insiders and outsiders. So Christ is not intimidated by our imperfection. He is the only remedy to that imperfection that makes us restored and righteous. And the reason I highlighted David the seventh here is to show that, again, it's taking pains to talk about all of Judah. So obviously that would include all of David's brothers as well. But I think it's special to name all of the brothers and to show that David is the last son, to show that he was always the last one considered and the one who was seen as the least important. But if you remember what God told Samuel, right? When Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel after Saul, he saw Eliab and Eliab's strength and Eliab's, and he's like, this has to be the guy. But God told Samuel, no, man sees the outward things, but God looks at the things of the heart. So yes, we'll be talking about David a whole lot more in the Chronicles. Um, okay. And the last thought to I meant to put this highlight near to the actual end of the chapter. For some reason I thought it ended here. But basically, as a thought to wrap up these chapters, throughout the whole blur of names, because if the first part was like a game of trying to figure out how many names you recognize, like the last part is like we don't know anybody. Going like not a lot of names here are very recognizable to us, but it's okay because throughout the whole blur of names, the point is God was always present, right? And you think like, hey, a bunch of these names are also referring to the people of Judah that existed uh or like generations that passed during like the exile, as you think of like the people who would eventually like the descendants of all these people mentioned here who would eventually go into exile, right? So you would think that the people who eventually went into exile, they would think like, oh, that's the end of us, that this is the end of the tribe of Judah, this is the end of the kingdom of Judah, this is the end of our home, our identity. God doesn't hear us anymore, he doesn't see us anymore, he doesn't care about us anymore. but God has always been sovereign. And because of God's faithfulness to his covenant to David and to his covenant to the people of Israel as a whole, God knew the names of each generation, right? God kept tabs on that even when the people forgot their past, even when the people forgot where they came from. God was always keeping tabs. God always knew. God always cared because God was crafting the lineage of Christ, who is the sole way of salvation. If you have not accepted Christ, who is the sole way of salvation, it's so simple. You don't need to travel halfway across the world. You don't need to take a pilgrimage to visit any holy place. You don't need the favor of any holy person, any church father, church leader, pastor, priest. You don't need anybody. You simply need to believe in your heart and you need to confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. When you do that, you are uh, accepting what Christ did for you, and it's being like it's starting the process of what Christ did being imputed upon you. Reba and I, the other day when we were reading the Word together, we talked about the concept of identifying as Christ, like in the grand scheme of things, right? I mean, you guys are well aware of like the LGBTQ community and how, I mean, some people, I mean, there are some people who say it for real, and then some people who just joke around about it. But the idea of identifying as something. Like, some people say I identify as male, I identify as female, and then some people make jokes about I identify as this, that, the other, right? But the point of salvation is you will never fulfill God's standards. You have to die. So when Christ came, he chose to identify as us so that we could, by faith, right, with believing in our heart, confessing with our mouth, and accepting him as Lord of our lives, we could identify as him so that we could be children of God. So that when God sees us, he sees the price that Christ paid when he sees us. He does not see the guilt anymore because the shame is completely taken away. Christ paid that price, and you are acknowledging it and making it applicable to you when you accept him as savior and when you join his death and resurrection through baptism, right? Because otherwise you're not supposed to have any other life after you die. You're supposed to die. The whole point is you need to fulfill the law. How can you fulfill the law without destroying your life? You need to you need to sorry, lost my train of thought. But the point being, when you are joining Christ in his death and resurrection, you are becoming a new creation. You are fulfilling the law that says you must die. That is how you die. You identify with Christ's death and resurrection that he did for your sake. So it's as if you are indeed dying and fulfilling the law that says that you must die, right? And when you come out again, you are no longer the old person who was unable to fulfill the law and the old person who was shackled to sin and damnation. You are a new creation born of the incorruptible seed that is the word of God. You are identifying with Christ, right? As Christ, as a co-heir with Christ, so that as Christ was called, you become a child of God, a son of God, a daughter of God, and you have an inheritance for you. You have eternal life. You are made holy. You are justified and sanctified when you are identifying with Christ through salvation. And it's just so humbling to see the grand scheme of things. Even with two chapters as unassuming as First Chronicles 1 and 2, you see how this was the plan all along. How God cares for you so much that throughout all these generations, right? Whoever Sismai, whoever that was, Tirana, right? Harrow, we don't know these people, but the point is, throughout all these generations, God still had you and me in mind for all of this to come to Christ. He knew us by name. It's so humbling. It's there is no God like our God. All right. We're closing our discussion. God bless you with these words.